Chapter 2. Mason. "Yes, Mom, I'm eating my vegetables." Mason shook his head as he cradled the cell phone with his shoulder so he could open the locker. "The food is amazing. Remember, I told you they hired a new cook." He'd been over this with his mother when he'd first arrived at training camp last summer, but she still continued to pester him whenever he called. "You just look so skinny on TV," she said. "I'm a wide receiver, Mom. I run a lot." He had actually put on a few pounds due to the food, but he'd never be able to make his mother understand that. She only saw her little boy, and even though he was in his mid-20s now, she still worried about him. The locker room door opened, and the room filled with noise from his teammates. There was no way he was going to get caught on a call with his mother. One of the new recruits had done that earlier this year, and the teasing had been merciless. "Mom, I have to go. I'll call you later." He hung up before she could answer. He'd owe her a big apology later, but it was better than being caught on the phone with her. "Mason, there you are. We were wondering where you ran off to." Blaine Hollis, quarterback and captain of the Tornadoes, opened his locker and pulled out a notebook. "Tucker and I thought maybe you'd snuck a girl back here." "A girl?" Mason chuckled. He barely had time to date with the game schedule and his workouts, and even if he did, he wasn't sure he was ready. His last serious relationship had torn his heart wide open, and he wasn't sure it was mended enough to try again yet. "You two are more likely to sneak a woman back here." Tucker, the team's star running back, had recently gotten married, and Blaine had just proposed to his girlfriend Kinsey. Mason was nowhere near that. "He's got you there, Blaine," Tucker said as he grabbed a notebook from his locker as well. "But if you weren't in here with a girl, what were you doing?" Mason swallowed, and his mind raced through plausible excuses. "I was calling the shop about my truck. It's been acting up lately, and I was hoping to get it looked at soon. I would have called from the cafeteria, but it was a little loud in there." "Hard to be quiet when the food is so good," Jefferson said. Jefferson was another wide receiver, and he was an enigma to be sure. Though younger than almost everyone else on the team, he was solid and seemed to have this mature air about him, like he'd already seen the world. "Has anybody met the cook yet?" Mason asked, grateful for the excuse to change the subject. Jefferson shook his head. "Nope. They introduced the helpers, but she's always claimed she was too busy." "I hear we're meeting the new athletic trainer today, though," Tucker said. Mason nodded as he grabbed his own notebook and followed the guys out of the locker room and toward the meeting room. One of their old trainers, Doug, had recently gotten married, and his bride had insisted they return to her home state of Alabama. Though he hadn't wanted to go, he'd wanted to stay married even more, and the team had been forced to send out an emergency notice for applications. Mason was less than excited about meeting a new trainer. For one, he was pretty particular about who he worked with, and he had really liked Doug. The other reason was because of his ex-girlfriend, Clara. She had wanted to be an athletic trainer, and every time he had to meet a new one, it reminded him of her. His mind wandered to her again as they walked down the hallway to the meeting room. Had she followed her dream? Was she working for some college team now? Or maybe even a professional team? She'd said that was her dream. For them to be on the same team, him playing ball and her stitching him up. That's what she'd said her dream was. But they must have been empty words, because she'd broken up with him not long after that. He'd pressed her for the reason, but she had just shaken her head and said they were too different, whatever that meant. So he'd left. He'd joined the Tornadoes and tried to forget about her. That was easier said than done. Though it was true he rarely had time to date, he had tried over the last few years. But none of them could compare to Clara. With her strawberry blonde hair and sparkling green eyes, she possessed an aura that could charm even the toughest Grinch. No matter what he tried to do, he couldn't seem to get her out of his mind. He took a seat between Tucker and Jefferson in the back row, as most of the other seats were already filled. The other men must have come straight from the cafeteria. A few minutes later, the head trainer, Justin, walked in. "Good morning. As you all know, Doug left us suddenly to follow his wife. Though there are only a few games left this season, we didn't want to go into the final games a trainer down. So we put out some feelers, and I'm pleased to say we found a trainer to take his spot. She comes to us with extensive knowledge and expertise." She? Mason had been spacing out, but at the mention of the feminine pronoun, he sat up straighter. True, Clara probably wasn't the only woman who wanted to be an athletic trainer, but he didn't know very many. Could they have actually hired her? "She's been working with the University of Texas, but is excited to join us now. Though she'll be working mainly with the offensive line, I'm sure all of you will chat with her at one point or another. Please help me welcome Clara Bradford." Mason gasped and leaned forward as if he'd been punched. Clara was here? "You okay?" Tucker whispered beside him. Mason shook his head, but didn't even glance toward his friend. His eyes were glued on the door. He saw the shimmery red of her hair before the rest of her appeared. She was a little older, but no less beautiful. In fact, if it was possible, he thought she was even prettier than before. Her face was a little more defined, and there was a glow to it that hadn't been there before. Though she was smaller than Justin, and probably every man in the room, she commanded attention. She always had. It had been one of the first things that drew Mason to her. "I'm pleased to meet you all, and look forward to working with you the rest of this season." "I bet a lot of the guys are going to look forward to working with her, too," Jefferson said in a hushed whisper. Mason shot him a glare. He had been so excited to see Clara again that he hadn't even thought about her working with the other men. It would kill him if any of them started seeing her. He could only hope that she wouldn't mix business and pleasure, or that he could convince her they belonged together before she fell for anyone else. His gaze traveled back to Clara, and her eyes caught his. She flashed a small smile, sending his heart thudding in his chest. Was she happy to see him? Surprised? Surely she must have known this was his team. Had she come hoping to run into him? "Okay, we'll let you get to the rest of your day. Don't hesitate to come to us if you have any questions." Justin dismissed the group, and Mason stood to head to an offensive line briefing with the rest of his teammates. His eyes, however, stayed on Clara until he was out of the room. "You have a thing for the new doc already?" Jefferson asked as he elbowed Mason. "She's not new to me," Mason returned. "Clara is my ex-girlfriend." Jefferson's eyes widened. "Oh, man, I'm sorry. Did you know she was coming here?" Mason shook his head. "We haven't spoken in years. I wasn't even sure she had become an athletic trainer, but I guess that question has been answered at least." "Are you going to be able to work with her?" That was a very good question. "Are you kidding? This is my second chance. She said we were too different when we broke up after high school, but here we are, on the same team. That can't be a coincidence, right?" Jefferson smiled. "You know I don't believe in coincidences. God has a plan for everything in our lives, even when we don't understand it at first." Mason cocked his head at Jefferson. Why did he get the feeling his teammate was talking more about his own life than Mason's? "Well, I don't know what his original plan might have been, but I'll certainly accept her being in my future."